Hi, I'm Jonathan Geyer, managing editor of the American Prospect. Now, we put out dozens of articles a week on our website, but we're really most proud of our print edition and our new issue called Assessing the Disaster, November, December 2020, has just shipped out. So we're going to talk with our editors and writers today about what went into this on-the-ground reporting, analysis, and coverage. And just to make note, we put this issue together. It's our sixth issue put out remotely during this pandemic. We were putting it to bed while we didn't know what the result of the US election would be. So we had a contingency. We were thinking it through. Obviously, the cover now has Vice President and now President-elect Biden and Kamala Harris on the cover, cleaning up the mess of the Trump presidency. So I'm really excited to introduce you all to our writers and editors and talk to you about the big pressing issues we've been covering as a magazine. So I'm thrilled to welcome our executive editor, Dayen, who in this issue is reporting on what he calls social distancing, the great stratification that the pandemic has brought on between the uber wealthy and the ones who are quite struggling and are quite poor. But given that this issue was put to bed in the middle of this election, we made a lot of predictions about what a Biden presidency would look like. David, what do you think? What's on your radar for what people should be watching in terms of what a Vice President Biden, now President-elect Biden, would do while in office?
Well, a lot of it is dependent on this one election that's hanging out there in Georgia on January the 5th to determine control of the U.S. Senate. But even before that, we can sort of get a sense of where the Biden administration is going by looking at the personnel who they are determining to choose for these key cabinet positions and even sub-cabinet positions. Here at the Prospect, we've been doing a thing called Cabinet Watch, which you've been involved with, as well as many of us on staff, looking at the different possibilities for personnel, who's up, who's down, who has the power, and seeing how all those pieces fit together, and then telling a story about what that means for policy in a Biden term. The other thing that we've been doing quite a bit is the Day One agenda, which sort of sets out a series of priorities that would be available to a President Biden, whether or not Democrats are victorious in those Georgia Senate seats. So these are things that, on the authority of the president given by Congress, that an administration can take, these executive actions. And so, you can see these as two pieces of a puzzle. The Day One agenda is sort of the realm of possibilities available. Cabinet Watch is sort of the people who would be tasked with potentially carrying that out, and what their perspectives are and whether they'll ever get to those kinds of policies. And then the third piece is the Senate election, which actually we're sending a reporter, Eli Day, down to Georgia this week for several weeks before the election to see what that situation looks like. So we're kind of trying to cover
each of those. Let's take each of those pieces. I know I've been reporting on the foreign policy angle of who the national security picks among a Biden-Harris administration would look like. It's very corporate. It's very middle of the road. It's a lot of longtime confidants of Biden as he was senator, as he was vice president. What's your assessment of the picks more broadly on domestic affairs, economic policy? In a word, what does Biden cabinets look like?
I don't know if I can sum it up in a word, but I think experience, the one word that you said, is a good one. So, it's very clear that Biden prefers people who have deep expertise in a various chosen field. It's kind of why I don't buy the Rahm Emanuel hype, by the way, because he doesn't have deep experience in transportation necessarily, even though the city of Chicago does have some jurisdiction over transit, as well as owning the airport in Chicago. So maybe in a backwards way he does, but experience is definitely preferred. And, what does that mean? If you're looking for someone with deep expertise in policymaking, the last two administrations in the government were on the Democratic side were Obama's and Clinton's. So policy expertise translates to Clinton and Obama expats. And so in some sense, that's not very surprising. However, there are, sort of shades of gray within there. There are certain Clinton, Obama appointees and Biden appointees from when he was in the vice president's office that, might have a different perspective than, say, a Tim Geithner would. What I think is that Biden is very sensitive to the various factions of the party, and he's trying to please them all. And so you're seeing a lot of picks where the response is it's better than the alternative, right? I mean, that's kind of a constant refrain. So, we could have had Lael Brainerd, who is sort of a Tim Geithner ally, as the Treasury Secretary. It looked that way for a long time. We got Janet Yellen, who is more of a labor economist and certainly divorced from the sort of Wall Street Democrats. We could have had Bruce Reed, who is a deficit hawk through and through, to run the Office of Management and Budget. We got Neera Tanden, who is loud on Twitter, but is probably, preferable to Reed on certain measures within OMB. So, he's trying to play these competing angles and competing factions. That doesn't always work. And I, you talk about it in the foreign policy space. I think also in domestic policy, you have two high-level members who come from BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager. And
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, companies really tried throughout the world to impress itself and place its people in key policy-making positions in a kind of disturbing way. So you see the head of the National Economic Council, although he hasn't specifically chosen him yet, but it's likely, is a guy named Brian Deese, who was at BlackRock working on sustainability issues. And the number two at Treasury, and it does not seem that this was Yellen's choice, that it was a choice imposed upon her, is this guy Adewale Adebayo, who was at BlackRock for a time, was the acting chief of staff to the CEO, Larry Fink. So I think
just lay this out for us, because Biden has made, climate issues a major priority, but BlackRock is really connected to fossil fuels. Can you just kind of lay out a little more deeply what are your concerns about BlackRock?
Yeah, so BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager. It has trillions and trillions of dollars of assets under management. A lot of what it does is index funding, where you buy the whole market. And, partially as a result of that, it has a deep investment in fossil fuels, in the fossil fuel industry and associated things. Now, Deese came in, he was a climate advisor to Obama, and he came in to work on their ESG, environmental sustainability and governance portfolio, to try to green BlackRock, essentially. That was his job. And in talking to activists who have pushed BlackRock on these issues, they're disappointed in Deese's performance there, and saying that he really was there to sort of apologize for some of BlackRock's greenwashing efforts rather than coming up with a real consistent climate policy. BlackRock is still the largest manager of fossil fuel assets in the world. It contributes mightily to deforestation of the Amazon, for example, and on a host of issues, including coal. Its promises and the things that it said it was going to do have not lived up to the results, and so that's, I think, motivating a lot of the concern about Deese, at least from the climate standpoint.
So anyone who wants to hear more about that, tune in to prospect.org, sign up for David Dayen's newsletter, Unsanitized, which is focused on the pandemic, but everything we live right now is touched by this pandemic. So a lot of original reporting, enterprise reporting on cabinet picks and on what the next president can do. Thank you so much, David.
All right, thank you.
We're now going to bring in our writing fellow, Brittany Gibson, and co-founder of the magazine, Robert Kuttner, to talk about Bob's feature in this November-December issue on healing the nation's divisions. Now, obviously, this is a historic election, and the country's been more polarized than ever in each direction. And what Bob has done in this really quite magisterial feature is consider what lessons America might learn from other countries who've had to deal with truth and reconciliation. Obviously, Americans don't always like to learn lessons from abroad. So it's a bit edgy of a conversation starter. So I'm going to leave it to Brittany now to ask some questions of Bob Kuttner, our founder.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. So Bob, in your piece, Healing America, you start off with this, complex situation. You say that some of the necessary healing that needs to happen is also at odds with each other. Can you explain more about what you mean by that?
Sure. I mean, this is obviously a very tricky, complicated exercise. It's a tricky, complicated story. So on the one hand, we have racial healing. We have overdue recognition on the part of white people that finally began this summer in the wake of in the woke, maybe, of the realization of what police violence had been doing to Black men for 400 years. There was a recognition on the part of large numbers of white people, maybe the largest percentage since the Civil Rights Movement, that radical remediation, reparation, acknowledgement of responsibility needed to happen. So put that over in one ring of the circus. In the other ring of the circus, we have the fact that 48% of Americans almost voted for Donald Trump. And so the question is, how do you bring those people, some of whom are hardcore haters, some of whom are not hardcore haters, some of whom who voted for Trump just because they saw the American system not delivering anything for them, some of whom were downwardly mobile white people who were not downwardly mobile because Blacks had been getting things that were their due, but because the whole system was screwing them. So how do you reach out to them without giving in to hate? That's a very tricky balancing act. These things are partly in tension with each other, but as an optimist, I would hold that they're not totally in tension with each other. If we can recognize our common humanity and our common interests, and recognize that the real polarization in this country ought to be everybody against Wall Street and not Blacks and whites at each other's throats.
And part of what you talk about in the piece, or part of your argument, it seems to me, is that, despite this hyper partisanship and polarization, the United States still has a shared culture and a shared set of values. And through, a really deep listening with each other, we can get back in touch with that.
I would put it slightly differently, although what you just said is a hopeful way of putting it. I would say ordinary people have similar goals. They want respect. They want economic opportunity for their kids. They want economic security for themselves. And that's sort of the American dream. Now, we're a long way from different members of the culture viewing those aspirations in the same terms. So a lot of smart people who try and do this work say that you have to begin by acknowledging the basic humanity of people with whom you have little in common, even with people who think they may hate you, in order to begin the process of depolarization and detribalization. That doesn't mean giving in to hatred. That means trying to find areas of common humanity from which then you can build more trust and maybe more political coalition.
But you also do say in the piece that in the short term, at least, things in terms of polarization are likely to get worse before they get better. What do you mean by that?
That's absolutely true. Well, think about what Joe Biden is going to have to do in his first few months as president. He is going to have to end the war on Muslims. He's going to have to end the war on immigrants. He's going to have to restart the Dreamers program. He's going to have to restart tracking domestic terrorists, which the FBI used to do. And some of these domestic terrorists armed with semi-automatic weapons are the hardest of the hardcore Trumpies. Fox News is going to go nuts, and right-wing talk radio is going to go nuts. And of course, there Trump is going to be sputtering mad, trying to rile up his base against everything that Joe Biden is going to do. So in the short run, merely moving the country back to something like normal is going to rile up the Trump base. And the process of reaching out to these folks and trying to find some areas of common humanity and common interest, that's going to take a little bit longer. And of course, it's going to be even harder if Mitch McConnell's entire strategy is going to be to make Biden fail.
Absolutely. And, while you're recognizing that there'll be obstacles to this, there is a demographic that you're quite hopeful about, and that's younger people. You say in the piece that younger people are, in a way, better positioned for the reconciliation and healing that needs to happen.
Yes, and that's not just, the usual cliche that the future belongs to the young and we place great hope in the young. I mean, if you look at public opinion data, young people defined as voters 18 to 29 voted for Biden by a 2-to-1 margin, even though in the election as a whole, it was around 53-47. Majority of white people, 56% of white voters under age 30 voted for Biden. White voters as a whole voted, I'm sad to say, for Trump. And if you look at other public opinion data, the younger the demographic cohort, the more tolerant people are of racial diversity, of LGBTQ rights, of intermarriage of all kind. And the other interesting thing I learned, I did about 25 interviews for this piece, interviewing a Baptist theologian named Robert Jones, that the right-wing fundamentalist white evangelical churches are declining as a percentage of the total population, and they are losing their young people. 20 years ago, they were 22% of the population, white evangelical churches. Now they're only 15%. And only 9%, according to Jones's data, of parishioners in those congregations are under age 30. So that means that younger people, even from a conservative evangelical background, and of course the right-wing evangelical church is basically an adjunct of the Republican Party. Now, their religious beliefs, let's posit, are sincere, but ever since Reagan, there's been this alliance of convenience between the right-wing white evangelical churches and the Republican Party. But young people, even from those backgrounds, are less susceptible to this. So, and I think some of the efforts that I describe in the piece about outreach that involve putting young people from different backgrounds together with each other to learn from each other what they might have in common and to appreciate their common humanity. A lot of these programs are being done among young people.
That makes a lot of sense, but I have to ask, it sounds like almost like another homework assignment for my generation or for younger generations to take on, in addition to all the other socioeconomic and political issues we're inheriting. Why is this not just another assignment for younger people to deal with?
I think without having to do any homework whatsoever, I think younger people are just becoming more tolerant than their parents and grandparents, more accepting of difference. All the public opinion data show that. So while there may be some young people who want to engage in this enterprise, this project of healing as an active endeavor, most young people, by not doing anything other than being themselves, are simply more tolerant, less hateful on average than their parents and grandparents.
That makes a lot of sense. You also address in Healing America head on a hypothesis from President-elect Joe Biden. He says that once he's in office and Trump is gone, Republicans will have an epiphany. And you say immediately in the piece, that's exactly what's not going to happen. Tell us what you think will happen.
I think Biden's hope was that by beating Trump, Republicans would say, well, Trump's a loser, we better move to the center. The problem is that the hardcore Republican base is still very Trumpy. And so for the next few election cycles, the Republicans who win primaries are going to be those who pander to the Trump base. And it's going to take a while. Now, I think over time, you can probably peel off some fraction of the people who voted for Trump, who did not vote for Trump because they're haters, but who voted for Trump because they didn't see either party delivering anything for them. And over time, I think the hardcore Trump base is going to gradually shrink. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to be because there'll be an epiphany this year or next year or this election cycle or next election cycle, but hopefully because Biden can demonstrate that his policies actually serve the interests of a lot of people who were very disaffected economically more than Trump does. And that's a public education process. It's also a matter of actually delivering some things. And that's also going to be challenging because Mitch McConnell is not going to want Biden to deliver much of anything. I do make one other bet in this piece, and that is that as the pandemic continues to be just dire, and as the economy continues to be dire, that maybe 5 or 10 Republican senators will decide once Trump is gone that they actually need to deliver something to their constituents, that people in red states are hurting just as much as people in blue states. And these senators are hearing from governors and mayors and school systems who are desperate for relief. And I do think that Biden may be able to peel away some Republican senators from this sort of iron grip of Mitch McConnell just based on self-interest.
Mm-hmm. Some might say that's optimistic.
So I think I'm sorry, I think we have to leave it there. But you can tune in to prospect.org to see Brittany Gibson, our writing fellow's coverage of voting rights and her recent dispatches from South Carolina during the election. And you can read Bob Kuttner's full article, Healing America, that goes even further, kind of unpacking all these historical precedents that can help Americans work through this particularly complicated, thorny set of issues. So sorry to cut you guys short, but
thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you.
So now we're going to get into a set of questions about what the Democratic leadership can do in the future of both parties, something that I think Bob Kuttner just touched on in his conversation with Brittany Gibson, including what do we do with accountability for Trump? What do we do with accountability for the Republican Party? And how this moment compares to 2008, let's say, when Barack Obama took over from George W. Bush. So for this conversation, I'm going to bring in Alex Sammon, who's a staff writer with The Prospect. In our November-December issue, he asked some very difficult questions about what accountability is going to mean for the Trump administration. Now, I know, Alex, a lot of people are squeamish about prosecuting Trump, and they think that, that's not how our democracy works. What do you think about that question? And do you think those people are wrong by saying we shouldn't hold Trump accountable?
Yeah, I think it's I understand obviously where that impulse comes from, but I think it's a pretty misguided one, and a lot of the rhetoric around this, has been stuff to the effect of, well, prosecuting a political rival is the definition of a banana republic sort of political environment, and in my mind, it's very much the opposite. In a banana republic, you would see the powerful and the wealthy held to a different standard than everyone else. And so for Trump to have committed this incredible array of crimes, I mean, just a wide variety of criminal acts, for him to not face any prosecution whatsoever would actually be much more of a sort of banana republic than to prosecute him. And so I think that's a very important thing for us to focus on, is that in a healthy democracy, rich and powerful people are not held to a different standard than other people. And if you break the law, you have to be held to account for doing that. And so I think it would actually be very much the opposite, that a healthy democracy, as opposed to a banana republic sort of one, would result in Trump seeing some serious accountability, or at least scrutiny for what he's done.
So I want to welcome in Harold Meyerson, our editor at large as well. Harold's piece in this issue deals more broadly with the state of the parties and where things will go from here after the Democrats kind of didn't perform as well in some Senate and House races as we might have imagined. But Harold, what's your view on whether we should or could or will hold Trump accountable for all of the, multifaceted crimes and misdemeanors he's committed? I mean, you probably remember pretty clearly what happened when Barack Obama came in 2008. There wasn't accountability for torture. There wasn't accountability for the war in Iraq. What's your forecast or your suggestion for what should happen now?
Well, my forecast and my suggestion are not the same thing. My suggestion, along with what Alex just said, is that a crime is a crime, no matter who commits it. That's my suggestion. My projection is that Trump is likely to pardon his family, Rudy Giuliani, anyone who has been particularly subservient to him, and himself. I do not think there will be federal prosecutions of any of the Trump crew, and his pardoning of Michael Flynn and commuting the sentence of Roger Stone, I think, are an indication as to what he might do in his remaining 2 months in power. That leaves the state of New York, where both the Manhattan District Attorney and the State Attorney General, Tish James, are looking at some of the business and non-business, like paying hush money to
right.
So I think this is it's up to you, New York, as the song has it, as to whether in fact there will be any prosecutions.
So I write about in this issue how all the former Trump officials have actually, even those who did really terrible stuff in the White House, have been succeeding fabulously, ended up with even more luxurious careers and successful stock options on corporate boards. Now, Alex, I know you have accountability on your mind, and you've written on the website recently on how to bring an end to the Bush era. Some of that's like, talking seriously about ending the Department of Homeland Security, which is this Bush legacy. But what are there other ways you think about accountability more broadly than just in the courtroom?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of places we could see accountability, and the courtroom is obviously going to be the most contentious and probably the where a lot of the attention goes. But there are a lot of different ways for us to see this. I think we can see it even with the Democratic Party, which is obviously something that Harold has touched on, and I think has been kind of a theme in this issue. Is we need accountability. Accountability has to be part of the process for Democrats at home and for the country broadly. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities in terms of cabinet appointments for Joe Biden, in terms of leadership positions in the House and the Senate for Democrats, but also, it does come down to, a lot of it comes down to the fact that there has been this legacy of a refusal to really get into what accountability requires, and that happened under Obama, obviously, and it happened with Democratic administrations prior to that. And the problem with that we see again and again is the refusal to touch that stuff doesn't make it go away. It just makes it come back more brazen, more powerful in years to come. And so I think that again, it's not going to be fun for the Biden administration to say, all right, we really have to, root this stuff out. We have to crack down on it. We have to investigate it. We have to get it all out there. And the Trump people are going to squeal and they're not going to like it. And it's not going to be fun for Democrats to stand up to that. But if you don't do it, the result is that it's going, it only ever comes back, and it only ever comes back more brazen than it was before. And so I think that if we want to get off this carousel, it's incumbent upon the Biden administration to do some of the stuff.
There is a classic 1905 book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall, which is the recorded musings of one of the Tammany bosses. And he makes a distinction between honest graft and dishonest graft. Honest graft, can sort of squeak under the bar of being legal, but it still stinks. And, in addition to accountability, you want to take, temptations for corruption out of the governmental process. And that deals with campaign finance reform. That deals with simply the role of big money, which is pervasive in our system and determines so much of our system. So, beyond what goes on in the courtroom, there's also what's permitted statutorily in terms of the role of money in politics. That's a huge thing that we need to continue to focus on.
So Harold, what is your assessment right now of the state of the parties? I know in your article that kind of national identities have now been eclipsed by more localized identities, and that's really affected.
I said localized identities have been eclipsed by national identities.
Oh,
that's okay.
That's what I meant. Yeah, passive voice gets me every time.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Yeah, tell us what you mean by that.
Well, what I mean by that, it has several dimensions. One is we keep hearing about, Biden won, but there were all these ticket splitters who then down ballot voted for Republican legislators and members of the House and members of the Senate. And yes and no. So everyone knows the yes part of that. Let me go with the no part on that. If you look at how many House districts Biden carried, it looks like it's 223. If you look at the number of House districts Democrats won in the House, it's 222. So what is wrong with this picture? And actually the popular vote margin of 6 million and plus that Biden has over Trump, I suspect when all the votes are counted, Democratic House candidates will have a margin of maybe 4.5 million. I mean, it's not that different. What's different is raw numbers favor the Democrats, but the way we do districts in the United States, even apart from gerrymandering, the way we do districts, clusters all of these urban voters in districts where they vote 80% for the Democrat, and then all the rest, there's more districts that are more evenly balanced or go Republican. So, the Democrats' problem isn't so much necessarily getting a popular vote majority. It's getting it in places where they're weak, and they're weak in lots of places. And in those places, you have a whole lot of voters who tend to be more conservative on a whole range of social issues. As Paul Starr pointed out, I thought in a brilliant piece we ran on our website, we're in a period where there are challenges to the general reign of whites over black, men over women, straights over gays, religious over secular, and native-born over immigrants. You don't have to be down the line on all of those to still think one or two of those are really bothering you if you're a social conservative one way or the other. And, the Democrats get painted across the board as the party that is liberal on all of those changes. And with the eclipse of local media, which is, I think, a major fact in, by default, creating a national identity around social issues for the parties, you get things like a number of Latino communities that are more traditional, voting a lot more Republican this time than the Democrats counted upon. That's going to be very difficult for the Democrats to counter. I think they need to really focus, in addition to those social liberal issues, they really need to focus on bread and butter issues, on economic issues that really help the working class. If you look at the Democrats who've done a Susan Collins, survived politically in a state that really isn't where you think they would survive, you look first at Sherrod Brown, who is a solid liberal, but emphasizes so many working class issues that Ohio voters elect him no matter. I think that's a model for where the party has to go. I think to a degree, Joe Biden gets that. To another degree, though, since he's still drawing from a Wall Street pool of possible appointees, he's not there all the way. And the Democrats, I think, need to be there all the way.
So I know both of you, after the election, as the vote count was coming in, had very harsh words for the House and the Senate leadership. In our last minute together, Alex, what's your general takeaway? What's your message for the leadership in Congress of the Democratic Party on what to do now?
Well, I think that no one would disagree that the result that especially in the House, that Democrats turned in was nothing short of basically a debacle. I mean, it was something where we had forecasted, confidently that they were going to add seats, maybe add up to 20 seats, and they ended up losing seats. I at last count, I had more than 10, I believe, maybe close to 15. I mean, that's a terrible showing. I mean, and I think that, obviously in any situation like that, you would say there has to be some introspection, there has to be some turnover, and we have to think of a different way to do this. Obviously, the octogenarian triumvirate at the top of Democratic House leadership remains totally uncontested. They're back in the saddle for another round. I wonder if, Nancy Pelosi said she'll do just one more term as Speaker. I'm not supremely confident that will even hold. It seems like there has to be some sort of, some change in the way we think about things tactically, and obviously, could it be ideological with a stronger voice from the left wielding more actual power? I think that would be important and would be good. But I think it even just comes down to tactics, and obviously there is something missing in the tactical approach of this leadership group. And I haven't seen anything that would lead me to believe that's getting addressed right now. And that obviously is a concern.
So I think we have to leave it there, but thank you so much, Harold and Alex. And just, sign up for Harold Meyerson on Tap, twice weekly newsletter. Alex is also writing for our site at least twice a week. So just check out prospect.org. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
So now we've had a chance to talk about what a President Biden could do, what's going on in Congress, how the country could heal from this election, but we haven't talked about the judiciary and the courts. So now we're going to bring in Marcia Brown, writing fellow, who co-authored with Rachel Cohen, a freelance journalist and former writing fellow, a really important piece on judicial overrides, co-published with The Intercept. And we're also going to bring in David Dayen, our executive editor, to kind of hash out these issues. So look, this is a complicated piece. It goes through tons of court cases, some really flashy, some not so sexy. Maybe Marcia, could you just start us off and explain, what is the thesis here? Why should the general public care about judicial overrides?
Yeah, so Rachel and I wrote a piece where we started actually by highlighting a case about Lilly Ledbetter, who worked for Goodyear Tire, and her entire time there was discriminated against on the basis of her sex. And so she was underpaid compared to managers who did the same work. But she didn't really know she was underpaid until she neared retirement. So that was about 30 years down the line. And when she brought suit, the court said the statute of limitations has expired. You can't bring this case. And instead, so in the dissent, so RBG wrote in her dissent, she said, actually, the ball is in Congress's court, and Congress can change this, and Congress can overturn and effectively nullify this decision. So the first piece of legislation that Barack Obama signed in 2009 was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. And part of that was a lot of public excitement behind, ending pay discrimination. And so in the piece that we've written about a lot of other cases like the Lilly Ledbetter case that Congress can nullify and effectively overturn that would make a really big difference. And some of them might not be as flashy as Lilly Ledbetter or have, someone who really represents the cause the way she did. but they would still make a really big difference in a lot of folks' lives. So that's the piece, that's the thesis of the piece. And we really also push the idea that this is a way for Congress to take back power, whereas the court has really taken on this role of a parsimonious readings of court cases. This is a way for Congress to clarify the language, to update the law, which is a really regular part, run-of-the-mill part of legislating, part of lawmaking.
So Rachel, are there any judicial overrides that Congress is considering right now that are particularly pertinent?
Yes. And
Tell us about them.
Okay. One thing that we sort of make in our, an argument that we make is that there are sort of these scattered judicial overrides that Congress has considered, but there has not been sort of a systematic strategy for going issue by issue, area by area. So that's what we are proposing. But there are some issues that Congress has considered now. We talk about the issue of qualified immunity for police officers was a really big issue that came up after the death of George Floyd this summer. And in a comprehensive police reform bill that the House passed, they would be able to effectively end qualified immunity, which would, tackle a Supreme Court case, a decades-old Supreme Court case. There is also a comprehensive labor reform bill that the House passed in February called the PRO Act, which, among other things, addresses some old, bad Supreme Court cases that have for decades hobbled labor law. So we commend that, but also recognize that there are way more Supreme Court cases than just those few that the PRO Act addresses, and we want people to be aware that an active, proactive, aggressive, even pro-labor federal legislature could tackle a wide range of really anti-worker Supreme Court cases, and we list out some of what they are. And yeah.
So David, I guess the bigger question here is, what can Democrats do with the conservative court? Obviously, we have a Supreme Court justice. We're already seeing this kind of play out. Does this relate to some of the questions of executive power that you've been writing about? Or sort of what is your strategy for dealing with this hyper-conservative Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think this is a great way to deal with that. This was a co-production with The Intercept, and when they brought this idea to me, I immediately perked up because, there's so much despair about the court being lost to conservative hands for a generation. And what's not really implicated in that is the fact that Congress, as a co-equal branch, has the ability to counteract the court's drift to the right simply through these statutory overrides. A large segment of what the court does in its opinions really is looking at statutory language rather than constitutional questions. So all of those cases are subject to having the legislature simply clarify the statute along the lines that they want. And it's really a mode of thinking. Number one, just sort of gets at that despair. And the second thing that it does is it makes the judiciary, frankly, think twice. We think about the judiciary as these automatons who are dead set on putting through conservative rulings time and again. But if they know they're going to be overridden over and over again, and that's a routine practice within Congress, then they have to think a little more about making these hard right rulings, these somewhat parsimonious, as Marcia said, rulings, if they're just going to be reversed by the Congress. So I think it's a very important piece and something that I hope that future staff and lawmakers really think about when they're considering this issue with the court.
Now, Marcia, can you talk us through why there haven't been that many of these congressional overrides recently? I understand that that's a pretty crucial quotient of this.
Yeah, so if you look at the history of Congress, we've seen a lot of these overrides pass, they often are passed as part of comprehensive legislation, which is what Rachel talked about when she was talking about a few different current pieces of legislation in Congress. There are other ones like the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the New Way Forward Act, which are all different current pieces of legislation making their way through the House that address these cases as part of larger comprehensive legislation. But you can also attack these judicial or statutory overrides onto other pieces of legislation that are totally irrelevant to whatever the override is. And I think a great example of this is a case where Republicans, as they historically have been more willing to, it seems like they're more willing to do this, and we're kind of encouraging Democrats to see this as also a way forward. And so there was a case in 1970s with an endangered species, a fish called the snail darter in Tennessee, and it was only found in this one river. And the Endangered Species Act passed in 1973, and environmentalists said, "Oh, but there's this fish in this river, and you can't build this dam." It was called the Tellico Dam. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the court said, "Yep, that's right. You have to stop construction on this dam because, this is the intent of the law." And Tennessee's Republican representatives, they said, "Well, actually, we're going to carve out a little exception to the Endangered Species Act for this specific Tellico Dam project." And they attached that to an appropriations bill, and that passed through the Congress. And that is a really actually normal way of lawmaking, and Democrats can do the same thing for other areas. They can say, this is the law, and we're going to carve out this exception because that's lawmaking. And so so it's really a good example of some environmental cases, but also an example of like how Congress can legislate. And I think Rachel could also add a little bit more about congressional staff too, and how that has also affected whether or not these overrides pass.
Yeah, Rachel, I'd also love to hear too, tell us more about how that nitty gritty works, but then I also want to hear about some of the less headline grabbing cases that are kind of substantively really important, but don't have that kind of cachet that some of the others may. You're on mute, sorry.
Thank you. I muted because there was a truck going by. I love this question. So as Marcia was saying, when we were trying to figure out, well, why has Congress sort of let this legislative tool fall by the wayside? They used to do more of them, they do less of them now. We found a couple of different factors, and one of them, at the time when judicial overrides were really, at their peak, or sort of regular routine things, congressional staff was also much greater. There was more capacity on these committees. Today, a lot of congressional lawmakers outsource these to outside advocacy groups. I mean, in some ways, the prospect is doing what we would hope a committee staffer would do. Hopefully, we will be able to get our information to committee staffers. But to your question, so one of the areas that I looked at was disability rights. And there's been for a really long time this bipartisan 50-member disability rights caucus. They have, there are Congress members who stake a lot of, the reputational cred on being good for disability rights, but they have not made overturning some really, really horrible Supreme Court cases part of their direction. And you might say, why? Why is that? And I interviewed a lot of disability rights attorneys, and a lot of it is because, unlike the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which has a really sort of clear and crystal equal pay for equal work thing, a lot of the issues that really, really on a day-to-day basis affect the ability for a disabled person to, defend their rights and get what they legally are entitled to, turns on kind of technical, legislative, sort of obscure legal doctrine, like the burden of proof. And so, there are cases where, Congress could overturn Supreme Court cases that said, when a student with disabilities is trying to get their rights, received under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, the school should have the burden of proof, not the parents. That's a very sort of easy thing that Congress could take on, but that would require them to sort of take on an issue that sometimes has less headline grabbing potential. So we want Congress to, as David said, to really change their mindset and realize that like these are winnable, meaningful, impactful fights, and maybe the public needs to help pressure them a little bit, but we hope that lawmakers take it on.
Yeah, David, so we have about 3 minutes left. Tell us, I mean, I see this feature really fitting into this kind of ideas-driven report and shepherding at the prospect, similar to the day one agenda of let's look at the realm of the possible when it comes to the judiciary, legislature, executive power, and what can really be done. Can you tell us a little more about how that came about and what you kind of see as maybe the next project?
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, it really comes down to power and who has it. The Congress has essentially been abdicating and giving up their power to the judiciary to set standards on what their intent was for various laws. I mean, if you look at it that way, it's kind of absurd, right? I mean, Congress has decided that the intention of what they wrote is in the hands of 9 unelected folks in robes rather than them, and they can make those choices for themselves. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this falls into continuum with Day One agenda around, what is the realm of the possible, and how can power be wielded for tangible progress to help people. Rather than just sort of despairing that there are these constraints upon the system through checks and balances and what have you. Yeah, I mean, I think it fits very well into our construct. And I want to touch on one thing that Rachel was getting on, that there are some bipartisan kind of ideas and support around a lot of the things that Marcia and Rachel wrote about. Disability is one, antitrust is another. I mean, the House Antitrust Subcommittee report, which showed a series of recommendations for how to fix antitrust. One part of it just listed 10 Supreme Court rulings which could be clarified in omnibus legislation, where it just restates what the legislative intent was. And the Republicans on that committee, at least some of them, said that while they have problems with certain parts of the documents, other parts they would recommend. I think there's an opportunity there for real bipartisan concern, and really everyone in Congress should think about, do we want to have control of our own intentions or not? Do we want to give them away to the Supreme Court? So everybody, Democratic or Republican, should have a stake in that. And there's a path here written by Marcia and Rachel very expertly of how they can do that.
Well, congrats to you, to The Intercept, to Rachel and Marcia for putting together such an agenda-setting report. So we're going to now keep Rachel here, and we're going to bring in our deputy editor, Gabrielle Gurley. We're going to talk now another issue that's kind of been in the backdrop of what we have been talking about today, but haven't really dived in on, is the pandemic. And Rachel is obviously an experienced education reporter and has been writing for us about how the pandemic is affecting teachers, students, classrooms. Deputy editor Gabrielle Gurley, who I guess will join us momentarily, has been looking at how it affects transport, the workforce, bus drivers, the kind of transportation system that is so crucial for all of us. But Rachel, can you tell us a little bit about this major story you did for us on education and the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. And I was so glad to get to do that for the Prospect. So education is one of the areas that I follow and cover, but I don't do it full time, obviously. But I was sort of consuming it relatively full time. I was reading basically everything that was coming out across, like, about school reopenings and the pandemic. Like many people, I feel like I have just kind of become, perhaps to an unhealthy degree, addicted to pandemic news journalism, so I was very interested in the intersections between schools and transmission and kids and how remote learning was going. And it just became very clear to me that a lot of assumptions were being made, a lot of claims based on studies that didn't prove what the studies said they showed. And I wanted to understand sort of both why it felt like a lot of critical skepticism was disappearing from this conversation around schools, and also, why is it that we were seeing that Black and brown families were the least likely to want to go back to school, even though everyone was saying they were the most likely to be hurt from doing remote learning. And there were sort of a lot of tensions and questions, and not many people are wrestling with it. So I really appreciated the opportunity to sort of try to answer the question of why has this debate grown so fraught? Why, more polarized than most things in this pandemic in a lot of ways, and what do we know about what does the research actually say at this point, and what are we kind of hoping it says?
So we're talking to Rachel about how the pandemic is affecting education. I want to bring in Prospect Deputy Editor Gabrielle Gurley, who in our new issue has a feature on transportation in crisis, how buses, trains, all of these transportation systems cities are so dependent on are just being totally ravaged and transformed by the pandemic. I guess one thing, Gabrielle, I was really interested in is how it affects the workforce, the people that run these systems. But can you just tell us, what do you think are the most crucial issues right now dealing with the pandemic and transportation?
Well, happy to start off with the workforce, Jonathan. It has had, as you can imagine, a devastating impact on the workforce. The beginning of the pandemic, there were quite a few struggles with how to protect drivers, bus drivers. Not so much of a problem in light rail or subway systems. Obviously, those folks are in compartments, so they're pretty much sealed off. But how to affect bus drivers? Some transit systems didn't cover themselves in glory right away. Drivers had to rig up plastic, for example. There's a notorious example of a driver being disciplined. But systems soon came to different ways to protect drivers. Plexiglass inserts were the most common way. Some systems had chains or other barriers between the drivers and passengers. So systems have come around. There have been notable fatalities, particularly in New York, has had a very, very high rate of driver deaths, less so in other systems. But now I think the systems, for the most part, whether they're smaller systems in rural areas or larger systems in the big cities, have gotten a grip on how to protect the workforce. Now we're beginning to see layoffs. Some systems have already had to lay off people because they've had to cut back their service offerings. So, those part-time employees, for example, in larger systems have had to stay home, stay off the job. But now as systems are getting into planning for the next fiscal year, we're seeing proposals that are pretty draconian. WMATA, which is the Washington area system, has announced that they're going to propose to lay off a few thousand people. Similarly, in New York, is talking about laying off close to 10,000 people in the coming years, absent a fiscal relief from Congress. So the workforce has been pretty devastated. When you look at riders similarly have to adapt. Riders have pretty much deserted transit except for those areas where they haven't. If you're an essential worker, if you're a relatively able-bodied senior, you're still using transit. I observed in Philadelphia, if you are trying to get downtown from certain neighborhoods, and you're an essential worker, your bus is full. Your bus is full going into the downtown area, and it's full coming back on lines that have hospitals, for example, or in university areas where there's still a certain amount of students who are on campus. So service to, and those areas frequently tend to be communities of color. If you're here in Washington, service to downtown Washington is if you're not coming from a community of color or from a essential worker corridor, if you're living in a neighborhood where there are large amounts of remote workers, your bus lines are pretty empty. The red line here in the District of Columbia is fairly empty. If you're concerned about social distancing, and you don't need to be concerned on the red line because there are barely any people riding it. So it really does.
Well,
it really does depend on where you are.
These issues really connect, I think, because look, Rachel's covering essential workers in a different way who are teaching schools, keeping schools clean. Parents need to get their kids to school, on public transportation. What happens now if those systems are really under stress? I mean, Rachel, how do you synthesize those issues in terms of, especially, schools and cities, where, public transportation is the lifeblood of how people get around?
Yeah, it's a great question. And they are very connected. And sometimes, unfortunately, people have not been drawing the connections to these issues that I think is important. A lot in the beginning of the pandemic, so much of the conversation around schools was just about, well, how sick are kids going to get? And in the beginning, people thought kids don't even get COVID. And then people realized, okay, no, it's actually just because tests were in short supply. So we weren't actually testing children. Then once people realized, okay, kids do get COVID, but they don't get as sick as older people. They definitely don't die anywhere near, seniors. That deaths are rare, although they do happen. But, over the summer, people realized, okay, so kids do get COVID, but how much do they transmit? Do they actually pass it on to others? And the research was sort of trickling out around this, but it's such a huge question because because the question of should we reopen schools isn't just a question of what are the learning impacts for children. It's also, well, what about the teachers in the building, the cafeteria workers, the janitorial staff, the bus drivers, the parents and family members who are maybe essential workers in their own homes that kids could bring it back. So these are all really big questions. And I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about schools, they think, oh, okay, well, if you have children in a classroom wearing masks and a teacher, they can sort of start visualizing that. But that's not actually what a school functions like. Schools have lunchtime. They have congregations in hallways. They ride public transit to schools. You have to get to school and back. They have after school care. So there are sort of all of these elements that some policymakers are thinking about, where it's like, if in New York City, when you reopen schools, you are also putting hundreds of thousands of more people on the subway to get to school because that's how they do it. In DC yesterday, I think it was yesterday or this week, they made worrying announcements about cuts to the metro because of declining ridership. And some people rightfully pointed out that those cuts could have incredibly bad impacts for kids who rely on the metro to get across town to go to school, because only like a quarter of students in the district go to their local neighborhood school, and many kids travel all over the city. So transportation and schools are deeply connected. They're also related for transmission. They're also related for workers who are on there. Teachers and transportation workers have different levels of risk than children, but they all live in households. So these are all sort of questions, and we're still kind of, I think a big factor, and this Gabrielle was saying, is that a lot of it just depends on how crowded something is. So, my risk riding on the red line that's very pretty empty is similar to a classroom that is at 25% capacity instead of 100% capacity. And that's also why we understand that indoor dining at 25% capacity is not the same as indoor dining at 100% capacity. Now, I personally think we shouldn't have indoor dining at all because eating, whatever, but we do collectively recognize that the number of people in a space is a factor for all of this and an important one. So that's my answer.
So we have to wrap up momentarily, but I want to bring in Gabrielle one last time. I mean, funding is being slashed severely. A lot less people are using public transportation. You are our transport expert. Is public transportation dead?
Public transportation is not dead.
Yeah.
There have been all sorts of articles and discussions about the death of public transportation. It is no more dead than cities are dead. It will need to be resuscitated, and it may take on a different form in the new normal when we get there, once there is mass distribution of a vaccine. But I think what is good for policymakers and readers and viewers to remember is that once we get into a new normal, people will want to go back to transportation, say in the summer or in the early fall. And if these draconian cuts take hold, where do they go? That is a question for Congress specifically. Cities and states cannot bolster public transportation at this juncture. We need an infusion. We need to see an infusion for folks who ride transportation, public transportation, not only in the cities, but in rural areas as well, where those populations are as dependent as they are in communities of color in the cities. You have communities of color in rural areas as well. Those people are dependent on transport, and they would like to see their needs, their needs also taken care of and met in once we get to the other side.
Well, that's a really valuable conversation. Thank you both, Rachel and Gabrielle, for telling us what we need to know about education and transportation at this critical juncture.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So with that, we're going to wrap up our launch of our November-December issue. You can read it entirely online at at prospect.org. And I just want to emphasize that we're really proud of this fair and deeply reported journalism that we put out. If you want to support us, we'd really welcome that. You can donate, you can subscribe to our print edition, you can sign up for our newsletters, you can follow us on all the usual social media platforms. And if there's one thing we can tell you is we want to hold power to account through fair, reported, and forward-looking, ideas-driven journalism. And really, we can only do that with your help. So please subscribe, donate, and join us at prospect.org. I'm Jonathan Geyer, and grateful that you spent the last hour with us. Thanks.